Welcome to the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee. It's great to see you. Minister, clearly fish are an important part of Brexit for all sorts of reasons, practical and totemic. And I wonder if we can just start with just a very brief word from you on where we are with respect to Northern Ireland fisheries in a Brexit context.
Well, the position with Northern Ireland will be very much the same as the rest of the UK, and we're clear that at the end of the transition period in December 2020, the UK will become an independent coastal state, rather like Faroes, Iceland or Norway now. We will have responsibility for managing and controlling all access and management of fisheries resources in our exclusive economic zone, which is out to 200 nautical miles or the median line. And we would see that applying to Northern Ireland as well. And we would envisage that there would still need to be annual fisheries negotiations with our neighbours, including Faroes, Iceland, Norway, and the EU countries. And those would likely take place in December. And we have a convention in the UK of all of the devolved administrations being part of our UK delegation. So at each December Council, I have representatives from the Northern Ireland administration alongside me.
Yeah, thank you. Commendably brief and concise. Thank you very much, Nick. Can I ask you why there's no fisheries bill? Why there's no consultation? Why it appears to many that the only people who are actually talking to Northern Ireland fishermen at the moment is this select committee? I
don't think that's the case. I'm meeting fishing leaders regularly. So I met Alan McCulloch earlier this year and meeting him regularly in the run-up to December Council. And I've had discussions with him about our emerging thinking for the white paper. We've got a commitment to introduce a fisheries bill in this session, and that's what we will do. We've obviously had a purdah with local elections and other things going on, but it's our intention to publish the fisheries white paper shortly.
OK, why has there been such a delay?
There's a lot going on, obviously, in the Brexit debate. We wanted to make sure we got this paper right, and we've been working on it, obviously, over the last 9 months or so. But it's really about the timing of the bills. We've had, first of all, to get the EU withdrawal bill through. That's been the big focus for government. And we've decided that we don't need to have the fisheries bill until later in this session.
So it's purely a parliamentary timetable?
It's a parliamentary timetable.
All right, thank you. On the 13th of April 2016, you posted a blog in which you said, in respect of the European Union's efforts at the North East Atlantic Fisheries Council, that they had seriously messed up, I think your words, on at least 2 occasions in the preceding year. Can you elaborate on those 2 occasions and exactly what the messing up was?
I'm going to try to. I think this was, from recollection, would have been April 2016 during the referendum campaign. And I was making a reference to 2 points which I'm going to have to now memorise. In the coastal states negotiations, annually, the EU currently represents the UK in all of those negotiations. And there were a couple of instances where the EU did an agreement using British fisheries resources as currency to get that agreement, particularly with Norway, but then gave the benefits coming back in to other countries. And although we had resisted it, they proceeded with that anyway. So annually there's often some controversy around the exchanges that take place, where we give Norway blue whiting, and in return Norway gives the EU Arctic cod. The UK gets some benefit from that Arctic cod, but most of the benefit goes to countries like Germany and Portugal. Yeah. The second area that I'm sorry, I'm asked for the details, so I'll give you the second instance that I think I was referring to was one where there was an in-year amendment made to the EU Faroes deal, which gave the Faroese additional access to UK waters to catch mackerel. And in return, the Faroese gave the EU some other fisheries benefits. I can't remember what it was. I think it might have been cod, but it was the Dutch that benefited from that inward exchange. So the point that I was making is, while the EU represents us in these international forums. We do have a problem, and have had a problem for a number of years, of the EU giving away British interests in order to deliver advantages for other EU countries.
Thank you.
Can I ask on that?
Well, I'll bring you in a minute, Bob, on this particular point. But would it be true to say, although this is a Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee, that the part of the United Kingdom that suffered the most from that messing up that you referred to in 2016 was in fact Scottish fishermen?
Yes.
Bob?
I don't quite understand. Do we not have representatives when the EU does these negotiations? Do we not actually have some civil servant or someone there saying, "Oi, actually, we're not getting a good deal out of this. What about us? And we don't agree this." Or does the EU just say, "To hell with you, this is what we're deciding for the collective good"?
Yeah, we have. It's more than observers, and we are there, and we have officials there who will explain to the EU what our position is. But this is an EU competence, and it is an extraordinary thing. But in all of these international forums, whether it's wildlife ones such as CITES or Convention on Biodiversity, or whether it's fisheries negotiations, it would be literally unlawful for the UK to represent its own interests around those tables. Only the EU is allowed to discuss fisheries in international fora of that sort.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you very much. Minister, it's always good to see you at any time, but we know you're a friend of a fisherman, and it's good to have you here to be able to answer some questions we have. In Portafogie, Mr Chairman, where we'll have the opportunity, this committee will have the opportunity to visit in June time, there's been a very proud tradition of fishing. We've seen the demise of fishing from 115 boats down to about 65 now, so it gives you an idea of the change there's been in that village. And there's been similar changes in Ardglass and Kilkeel as well, where the absentee MP tries his best, but not very well, to try and represent those people. But ever mindful that we in this committee have a responsibility. And I'm very concerned, Minister, if you don't mind me saying so, that you said you've met Alan McCullough from the Anglo North Fish Producers Organisation. Have you met Harry Witt from the Northern Ireland Fish Producers Organisation yet? If not, he's a new guy coming there just and just before Christmas of last year, but he's now the representative. If we haven't met him, I think maybe it'd be a good idea if you did. And what discussions do you have with him? The Chairman's asked you on a regular basis, not just have you had a wee chat to him in the last 6 months or something. If you don't mind me very gently saying to you that we need to be having a greater dialogue between the organisations that do represent the majority of fishing boats in Northern Ireland, and as such, then we can feed that information into the process. I know we can do it as individuals here as MPs, but it's just that personal basis. So can I ask you, is your intention to try and maybe build upon those a wee bit?
I'm more than happy to meet those organisations if they wanted to get in touch. We are at official level, so there's so DEFRA is meeting regularly with all of the fishing organisations, fishing representatives, to work up our approach to a number of things. I meet them also regularly, although obviously less frequently because I've got a wider brief. I'm covering many other issues as well. But the gentleman you mentioned in the Northern Ireland Fisheries Association, more than happy to meet them if you'd like to bring them in to talk.
If you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, I think maybe I'll take that opportunity to do that, bring them across. One of the greatest issues, and I know you're well aware of this one, Minister, is the issue of the Filipino fishermen. It's how to have visas to bring in people who have proven to be great workers, not disrespectful to anybody else, who they have options with. We're having a meeting next week with the Minister in relation to that. But I'm very conscious that it's one of the key issues that the fishermen tell me every time I meet them. How can we have better visa access for what is a skill and not just a job, in the opinion of many, especially those in the fishing groups? Have you had any opportunity to discuss with the Minister, Caroline Noakes, in relation to this matter? Have you brought it to her attention? Are you aware of it all? I'm sure you are, but just check, please.
I'm not. I don't think there's been a number of changes, obviously, to the Home Office ministers. I think 3 in the last 2 years. I did discuss the issue with the two predecessors of the current one, and I know that the Home Office have have generally taken a view that they don't think there's anything new to do in this space. They don't think they've changed anything, and they don't think there's a requirement to change the rules at the moment. However, we're obviously keeping all these things under review, and they have just asked the Migration Advisory Committee to do a big piece of work on our labour needs after Brexit, and there's no reason why that shouldn't, as part of that, consider this particular issue around Filipino crews, which I know is an issue for both Ireland and Scotland as well.
Minister, we're very happy to furnish you with the latest information we had in relation to that. Minister, it might be helpful for yourself as well. The Minister previous to Caroline notes who he had got the paper but wasn't very long in his position, unfortunately, so no decision was taken. So that, therefore we have the discussion now with the present Minister, which is coming up next week. I would seek your help and support in relation to that. I think maybe if you see the information that we have may enable you to do so. So I'll leave that one with you. Minister, you've also been very, very active on the voisinage agreement. Again, it's something that you talk about the fishing relationship we have, and we've got a good relationship in Northern Ireland with the fishing sector in the Republic of Ireland. We've been able to swap quotas and get on fairly well together, but that voisinage agreement will bring back lots of water back into the territorial gain of ourselves in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Could you update us on where we are with that one, please?
I'm about to write actually to Michael Creed, and I know that the Secretary of State will be on the list of issues that he wants to raise with him, and I think he's planning to have a meeting with him in the next sort of month or so. I mean, the position with voisinage is this is a convention that really dates right back to independence of the Irish Republic. It was always understood that Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland vessels would fish in one another's waters, and that was formalised through an exchange of letters later on, I think in the 1960s, and that's the voisinage agreement that we have always relied on and we believe is valid. The Republic of Ireland had a challenge in their own Supreme Court, and their own Supreme Court raised doubts over whether this agreement had been put in place in Irish law in the correct way. And the position of the Irish government is that they're committed to that agreement and committed to putting right whatever constitutional defects there are that are causing that problem. But with a lot of other things going on with the politics of Ireland, they've not got round to doing that now. So at the moment, it is the case that it's an asymmetric agreement. We are still abiding by the agreement. The Irish Republic is breaching the agreement. That's obviously not a situation that can continue indefinitely, and so it's an issue that we raise regularly. But at the moment, the stated position of the Irish government is that they intend to bring forward legislation to put this right, and so we await that legislation, but are continuing to put pressure on it.
Thanks much for that response as well. The last point, Mr. Chairman, is on the EMFF funding issue. Again, all of the villages, the fishing villages, have been able to take advantage of that, and indeed my own village of Portavogie, but also Ardglass and Kilkeel. It's an important funding regime that can enable the villages to grow. And if we look towards Brexit as we leave this time next year, we'll be out of the EU and free from Europe. Can I ask, Mr. Chairman or Minister, in relation to the funding regime that's in place, will it be your intention, or do you feel it should be the intention of government to continue that funding avenue for beyond Brexit?
Well, we'll be working on a successor scheme to the EMFF. It's a very important scheme for a number of reasons. The majority of that fund goes towards funding more selective gear types, so it helps us get towards delivering the landing obligation. And it is also quite important for coastal communities in terms of providing investment in infrastructure, harbour infrastructure, and things like aquaculture and fish processing. So it's fully our intention to replace it with a successor scheme. And what we've not yet decided, and this is a discussion that we'll have across government, is whether there should be a fisheries component of the future Shared Prosperity Fund that might deal particularly with things like harbour infrastructure. and then whether there should be a separate fund that is very much around science and selectivity of gear types, which would be more logically administered by the MMO and DEFRA.
We have a number of projects that are in the pipeline, so we'd like to see them continue. Minister, just to conclude, say thank you very much for all that you do for the fishing sector and for your energy and interest in that. It's much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, Minister. Can I just follow on a little bit from one of the questions that Jim asked? When did the Irish government renege on the agreement? When was the court case? How long have they been?
The court case was, I think, in roughly March 2017. I don't know if Nigel can remember.
I think, we know that the agreement was suspended in October 2016. So there was an agreement was suspended around that time, and that would have been as a result of the Irish court.
So it's about 2 years?
So it's about 2 years.
Right. And well, Minister, why are we so weak that we just allow that to happen and that we don't even think of, in part of these negotiations where the Irish government seem to be playing very hardball with us, that we're not actually saying, well, sorry, you're not going to have access anymore. You know, we're going to return their reciprocal reneging of the agreement.
Well, I think I'd say two things. I don't accept we've been weak, so we've given notice that we're going to quit the London Fisheries Convention, which will basically remove all of the access that other countries have in the 6 to 12 mile zone.
Including the Republic of Ireland?
No, because we're committed to the principles of the Voisinage Agreement, because that predates the EU. That goes literally right back.
Even though they're not committed to it?
They are committed to it. So I think this is the difference. They say that they are committed to the Voisinage Agreement, and they are committed to bringing forward the legislation. They've not got around to doing that yet.
They're too busy. Perhaps Mr Varadkar could spend a little bit more time looking at that rather than being in Brussels trying to weaponise the Brexit decision.
Well, I'm not going
to
get drawn into that, but,
no, but seriously,
I appreciate
do
the
you
point
not,
that you're making.
how long will this go on before we decide that we're going to, completely act the same way they are in terms of access to fishing?
Well, all I would say is we've got, at the moment, a much bigger game in play, which is that we're leaving the European Union. We're going to depart from relative stability as an allocation key in the future. We are going to take back control of our exclusive economic zone, and we've stopped the London Fisheries Convention, so we have a lot of balls in the air when it comes to fishing. I completely understand the importance of the Voisinage Agreement. We're committed to it, but at the moment we've taken the judgment that we're not going to throw an extra complexity in by suspending Irish access to our waters. But obviously, as I said, this is not a position that we can allow to continue indefinitely. And we've got a crucial period over the next few months as we finalise the withdrawal agreement and discuss a future economic partnership. And once we have fixed that, if the Irish Republic by that point haven't obviously reciprocated and fixed the constitutional defect that they have, then we would obviously have to consider at that point suspending their access and suspending the agreement so that there's some pressure on them to act.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. Were you personally disappointed when, despite all the kind of commitments that were given to fishing communities, that we weren't able to simply stop being part of the common fisheries policy at the end of March next year?
We've been very clear, both I and the Secretary of State, that we're disappointed that the European Union didn't take up our suggestion, which was that we should have sat as an independent coastal state after March as a third country. There was no reason, in our view, for fishing to need to be part of the transition deal. We could have
But why did we give in on that?
Because, put bluntly, in the end, the government believed that we needed to have that transition agreement for trade, including some fish sectors, so the shellfish sector need access. And in the end, we needed to take a decision that in order to ensure that we could give business certainty, including all businesses and businesses that trade with the EU, during that period, and to make sure that we were ready for the point that we actually left, we had to just accept that this was a short period of time, a little over 18 months. The needs required us to effectively accept that it was too complicated to try to get covered.
So basically the EU said if you won't get an implementation period at all, you won't get any of this if you don't stay in the CPF.
Broadly, that's it, yes, exactly. Yes.
Oh, that's useful to know. That's how they act. Can I just ask you very briefly perhaps to summarise, just so everyone's clear during that implementation period, what actually happens, and is there anything different at all? And how can we be sure that we will not be kind of roughed up because we won't have a voice in the committee?
I think in practice not much will change because, as we pointed out earlier, the really big negotiations that matter most to us, EU-Norway's the big one, but also EU-Faroes, those agreements in the North Sea, we already don't have really a seat at the table. We have to whisper in the ear of the Commission and hope for the best. And so broadly that'll be the same. That's not going to change. And when it comes to December Council, obviously the shares of different species are set in stone through relative stability. That's not going to change. And what you really argue about at December Council is the science and the total allowable catch, what the total allowable catch should be based on a scientific approach. And there are a number of ways that we exercise influence on that at the moment. Firstly, in the months leading up to December Council, we send our scientific experts in to advise the Commission, to give them our data, our analysis, often to pick up errors in their data, because we've got some of the best fisheries scientists in the world. And that will still continue, because we'll still be consulted, and the EU would still want that input. What will be missing is that, well, nothing will change in this December Council, December 2018. For 1 year only, in December 2019, we won't formally sit around the Council table. But we will probably take part in other forums to basically influence the Commission's thinking ahead of that decision. So in practice, I think not much will change at all. It's just things won't get better in the way that we would like to see.
As obviously a very, very committed fisheries minister, and we're all very pleased at the work you have done. I mean, do you waken up in the middle of the night sometimes and worry that in the end fishing will be kind of sacrificed because it's not seen as as hugely in the overall scale of negotiations? It could be the sacrificial lamb to get something else.
I don't worry about that, no, because I'm actually confident that that's not how Parliament sees it. And I think that as we embark on this big endeavour of coming out of the European Union, as a country we've got to act in good faith to all sectors, farmers, fishermen, financial services, everybody. And we have to, I think, be quite tough on those who slip into this mindset of saying, well, we have to sacrifice these people over here in order to help this group over there. That is not the approach that we intend to take as a government. It's not the approach we should take as a country. And I don't think it's an approach that Parliament would ever sanction.
Thank you.
Ian Payson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mr. Eustace, it's great to see you here, and thank you for the work that you have done and are doing with regards to fisheries. And I know I've been in some of those meetings with you, and I know that the fishermen appreciate the efforts you're making. I want to follow on from Kate Hoey's questions about how we avoid being done over in this transition year. I just want absolute clarity. This December, we will help set stock limits. And that will be the last time we'll really be at the table. I think that's what I heard you say. And next December 2019, we will really then have to trust those who are at the table to ensure that for the following transitional period, the year period, our fisheries will remain largely the same, our fishery stock rights will remain largely the same, but there may be marginal changes. Am I right in thinking that's the view?
There won't be changes in the Nigel can come in. So there won't be changes in the allocation shares, but there will be changes obviously to the TAC, the overall size of the TAC.
Okay.
And as I said, we will still.
That's the total available catch, which is set by scientists, and you're suggesting that will be very marginal during that period. Am I right to say that?
If I may, I mean, as the Minister said, the science will indicate the total allowable catch, and we'll be undertaking negotiations with the Commission and the EU Presidency, putting in our views on that science and negotiating prior to the final December Council deal. So we will be involved in the discussions right up until the last point. So our ability to influence those decisions and any adjustments to not the shares remain fixed as relative stability shares, but the total allowable catch and the associated rules that will apply to the final tax and quotas regulation will still be there. I mean, we'll still be able to influence that in the same way that we do now. It's just that we won't be in the council chamber.
So the writing of that scientific evidence becomes very crucial during the 2019-2020 period. Who writes that scientific evidence, and what influence do we have with the author of that?
It's so ICES, which is the International Council on the Exploration of the Sea. It's an international body. They collate data collected from a number of agencies. So ours is CFAS, and we have a vessel called the Endeavour that basically goes through our waters and does sampling and also looks at catch data to reach a stock assessment. And ICES have a role internationally in terms of validating that to an international standard. And then ICES provide that as the starting point towards to the Commission proposal. And to be frank, the Commission proposal rarely deviates from the ICES advice as the starting point. And then the type of additional science that we will add is if you have a particular problem in a mixed fishery with several stocks and a difficulty getting all of them to maximum sustainable yield, we often will do something we call a mixed fisheries analysis, which works out the dynamics of how best to manage those in that mixed fishery.
So there would really need to be a major climatic shock to change that scientific evidence during that year, something that is unenvisaged.
Yes, but we do, I mean, to be blunt, the marine environment being what it is, we do get those shocks year in, year out. So it is not unusual to have, so for instance, in the Irish Sea last year, there was a 300% increase, I think, in the cod, albeit from a low base. So for the first time ever, is it cod or haddock? Cod. For the first time ever, the Irish fishermen had a sensible amount of cod, but that was a 300% increase, but that followed years and years of cuts year after year. It's not unusual for us to get a sort of 20%, 30% increase or a 20 or 30% cut to particular species based on changing science across the year.
So during that year, we're going to rely on the scientists and a lot of trust that people are honourable.
Well, it's under the current CFP, the EU has got a legal obligation to follow maximum sustainable yield as the guide when setting tax. That's in the basic regulation, and they therefore start out with the position that ICES have set out. So the science tends to dominate the allocations, but that's not to say there isn't also political discussion. And around that table, the EU will obviously try to achieve a consensus.
Now, you've said in your remarks, and you've said it publicly on many occasions, that we're going to be an independent coastal state. Can you assure the committee that that will be in practice and not just in name? And how do you ensure that that will be in practice? What will we lay down to demonstrate we're an independent coastal state?
Well, when you leave the common fisheries policy, you automatically, under international law, which is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that becomes the new legal baseline. And we automatically at that point become an independent coastal state. And under international law, we are responsible for managing our own exclusive economic zone. I mean, ironically, this particular element of international law, the definition of the exclusive economic zone, was developed in the late 70s and early 80s, and its genesis is the defeat of the UK in the Cod Wars with Iceland during the 70s. At the end of the Third Cod War, it became established in international law that every nation should be able to control its exclusive economic zone out to 200 miles. So that's the legal position. That's absolutely crystal clear. And
that's a name, but in practice, what will that really mean? Where will we show the difference? Where will we show our teeth, if you like?
Well, in practice, I suppose the single most important thing is that we do not fetter our ability to alter access arrangements in annual fisheries negotiations. And because in any fisheries negotiation, access is the trump card. And we have a situation at the moment where lots of other countries are quite dependent on access to the UK waters. And we should be willing to say that we will obviously grant countries access to our waters, but that we want them to do certain things in return for that.
So in return for that, for example, would we be able to get a fairer share of some of the stock that we currently, our fishermen feel they don't get a fair share of?
Yes, fundamentally, to summarise the approach we want to take, we want to depart from relative stability and seek a fairer methodology, probably one based on what's called zonal attachment, that is where the fish reside. Yeah. And the tool that will get us to that fairer allocation is being willing to place restrictions on access.
And does that mean, for example, it could mean, for example, I should say, that Republic of Ireland fishermen who've depended some of our stocks, 70% of certain breeds, that they may lose out?
Well,
I'm not saying they will, but they may.
Well, yes, they may, and so the issue that we have right across Europe with most countries is that all of them are quite dependent on access to UK waters, and if I envisage what a sensible endpoint would be that we are still in a position where we're willing to grant countries access to our waters so that they can fish for fish as well, but that the quid pro quo for that access will be a fairer allocation methodology, and we're doing some work on what that should be.
If you were a Republic of Ireland fisheries minister, do you think you'd be better cozying up the British for the next couple of years rather than, let's say, getting on their backs?
Well, similar question to Hoey raised earlier. Look, at the moment there's a difficult negotiation going on, and there's obviously quite a lot of grandstanding that is taking place, both by the European Commission and by some EU member states. But in the final analysis, I think it is in all of our interest to put in place a good, comprehensive partnership where we work together and cooperate together.
Wholeheartedly agree with that, but I must say I think our neighbours' attitude has been very short-sighted.
Well, you may say that, but we, as the Fisheries Minister of the UK, I always have an open door to fisheries ministers from other countries. I want them to be involved in thinking about the future as well. I don't want them to just delegate this to the European Commission. They've got interests here in having a partnership with the UK, and I hope that we can get them to engage in a constructive way.
Very finally, there's been talk that during the transition period, and we've taken evidence from practitioners in this area, that during the transition period, that's an opportunity for us to look at infrastructure around our own fishing stock and our own fishing activities, whether it's in the far reaches of Scotland or across the south of England or here in Northern Ireland. Is the government going to set aside any resource to assist with infrastructure development? I think in particular of various harbour developments that need to be carried out in Northern Ireland. Would the government look at that year as an opportunity to help and assist develop those projects?
Yes, well, so while we remain in the EU, we still have access, obviously, to the existing funds, the EMFF fund, and that is being deployed in some instances to improve infrastructure in harbours. So in my part of the world, Newlyn in Cornwall has got a big investment at the moment to effectively regenerate their fish market and fish handling facilities, and I know similar things are happening in other parts of the country. And as I said earlier, it's our intention to replace the EMFF with a successor fund, but we've not yet designed that one. So some funds are being used. In addition, there's also a Seafood 2040 working group, and they're now establishing a leadership group. They published a report late last year setting out their vision for the fishing industry over the next 20 or so years, and basically investing in fishing communities and including in things like aquaculture was high on their list, and that's something that the industry themselves are taking forward too.
Thank you very much, Minister.
Minister, you've referred to maximum sustainable yield repeatedly, and absolutely you're right to say that we're bound by it at the moment, but we won't be when we leave the European Union. What consideration have you given to shifting to maximum economic yield, which many say would increase biomass and result in improved economic returns to fishermen?
I'm not familiar with that term. I don't know whether Nigel's maximum economic yield is a different. Yeah.
I think so. Maximum economic yield actually would set the catch level lower than maximum sustainable yield, and we're aware that there is an argument for that for the future. I mean, I think, if I may, Minister, I think our aims and ambitions at the moment are to deliver maximum sustainable yield. We'll continue to do that, and in the longer term we can review what other alternative management mechanisms there are in terms of ensuring sustainable fisheries. But at the moment our focus is very much on delivering maximum sustainable yield. And we've also got the challenge of the landing obligation as well, and we've got the challenge of managing fisheries out of the European Union. So our focus is very much on delivering all of those measures that would currently allow us to manage fisheries or continue to manage fisheries sustainably. Maximum sustainable yield allows us to do that. Longer term, we haven't done any full analysis of this, but longer term we may wish to explore other options, and maximum economic yield may be one of those, but we haven't done that work at the moment.
And to what extent do we think that the difficulty in getting sufficient crews from overseas, since a large number of boats in Northern Ireland are manned by non-UK, non-Irish nationals, is going to be affected by Brexit? To what extent do we think we need to perhaps look again at visa requirements for this particular workforce? And would you agree with me that if we don't, there's a danger that boats simply won't be able to put to sea, which will place us in a difficult position with respect to UNCLOS, which of course requires us to discuss with our neighbours access to our waters, particularly if we do not have the wherewithal to exploit MSY?
I mean, my view at the moment is that that would be, if we got to that sort of situation, we would be in a very different position to now. So the truth at the moment is we have fishermen who want to catch more fish than they're able to at the moment. And there is an issue around foreign crews, around the Filipinos in particular. I know that the Home Office are looking at that. And they've also got the Migration Advisory Committee looking at future labour needs. But we also, I think, could do more to get more British people into this industry. It is an area where a lot of them do well. They're often self-employed. They often join a crew but get a share of the catch. It can actually be quite a good way into the industry for some members of crew. And there are a number of schemes that are training fishermen. So I think in the last few years, some 500 new fishermen have been trained, young people who want to get into the industry. So I don't think we should just buy into the idea that, well, we just need foreign crews. You probably do need some labour of that sort. But fishing as a sector, generally has lower labour needs than sort of agriculture, for instance. So a typical crew, yes, at the moment they're quite reliant sometimes on foreign crews, but it's not like some sectors of agriculture where you have hundreds of people working on the same farm.
Lady Herman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's very good of you, Minister, and Mr. Gooding to come along to give us evidence today. Could I just ask you what seems the obvious question? When you say, Minister, that the UK is going to, when we Brexit, is going to be compatible then with the law of the sea, and we're going to manage our own exclusive economic zone. How are we actually going to manage it? How are we going to police it? How are we proposing to police it? Do we have gunboats? What are we going to do?
Yes,
I mean, it's a great phrase. We're going to manage, we're going to take back control, and we're going to have exclusive control. How do we manage that?
Yes. Well, we police it now. So under...
but it's going to grow.
No, so the EU don't have a navy themselves going around policing so-called their waters. So we already run the enforcement in our exclusive economic zone. And so Scotland have arrangements with contractors and providers who basically police that area. We have the Fisheries Protection Fleet, which has 3 vessels. We also, the IFCAs do a lot of inshore work policing. There's several dozen, I think, vessels available to them. We have things like Coast Guard vessels. We also do a huge amount these days by remote vessel monitoring. So in Newcastle, where the Marine Management Organisation is based, there is a big control room and a giant digital map at the size of the wall behind you that literally has every zone of our waters and every vessel that is fishing in it. And they monitor the fishing patterns of those vessels, and if they see suspicious behaviour or they see a vessel that is in a place it should not be, then they basically alert the Fisheries Protection Fleet, so there's an intelligence-led element to it as well. So we already enforce our exclusive economic zone. Obviously, if we were going into a world where we started to have agreements on access and restricting some of that access, then you would need to have additional resource to it. And the MMO have been working for the last 9 months on what that resource would need to look like. And
so we are planning.
That's
to
right.
Increase.
We're planning to, and I think the Royal Navy have just announced that they're going to have additional patrol vessels that could be used for.
Do we know how many additional patrol vessels?
I think they've announced 2 new ones. Yes. So in addition to the 3, I think they've just announced 2 new ones that could be used for fishing, but also for other enforcement activities in our. And
their
waters.
powers would be to board ships.
That's right.
Arrest crew.
Yes, and the Fisheries Protection Fleet is the oldest part of the Royal Navy, and they have a very, very good track record and know what they're doing in this area.
Right, that's very interesting. So, could you explain just to the committee how we're going to deal with the jurisdictional issues in Lough Foyle and Carlingford Lough? If we're taking back control, I did quote you, it's a mantra about taking back control. As you'll be aware, there is a jurisdictional discussion, let's say, around Carlingford Lough.
Yes.
And Lough Foyle. But we're taking back control, so how's that going to be managed?
I'm going to ask Nigel to come in on that specific issue. No, exactly. I'm aware that there's a discussion on it, but.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm not aware of the absolute detail of it, and this will be not so much a fisheries negotiation matter. So it's not an issue that we're negotiating or we will be negotiating from a fisheries perspective, but it is part of or would be part of the discussions between Northern Ireland and the Republic in relation to jurisdictional issues.
So forgive me for asking, how exactly would that take place? Because as you know, we don't have a Northern Ireland Assembly, haven't had an agriculture ministry in Northern Ireland since January of 2017. So presumably the Westminster government is looking after this issue, at least I have assumed it has.
So this will be, I think, the province of the Foreign Office. So it will be the Foreign Office that would lead on such jurisdictional matters. I mean, we can certainly write to the committee if you need more information.
Oh, well, I think it would be absolutely essential since we are doing an inquiry into fisheries and we've been assured this morning that the UK is planning to take back exclusive control of its territorial waters. That does have implications, I think, for Carlingford Lough and Lough Foyle. I think we would need clarification.
Okay, we're more than happy to write to the committee on that to explain the position on that as well, having consulted the Foreign Office.
Right, excellent. Right, just following up then from the impact of not having a devolved administration. Minister, you said in your opening remarks that the convention had been established, that we had representatives from all devolved administrations at the council meetings in December. So how did you get on last December without a Northern Ireland Assembly?
The DAERA have a very talented head of fisheries called John Spears, who I've worked with for a number of years. And in the absence of an elected administration in Northern Ireland, John Spears attended that delegation. And in the trilateral meeting that we have with the Presidency and the Commission, it was John Spears who attended alongside me and spoke to Northern Ireland interests.
how would you assess the impact on the Brexit negotiations in terms of fisheries in relation to Northern Ireland fisheries? What is the impact of the continued absence of a functioning Assembly and Executive in Northern Ireland?
Well, look, obviously, it would be preferable, and we all would like to see an administration there re-established and an agreement put in place, and that's what the government is trying to achieve. So it goes without saying that it is not ideal, as we are addressing these issues, that we don't have an elected administration there. But nonetheless, I mean, what I would say is the officials in DERA have not. They've not done their duty in the absence of an administration there. So on some areas, including on agriculture, for instance, they have published ideas and thoughts and thinking about what they need for Northern Ireland in the future. And when it comes to fisheries, we've been working very closely with them on what consequential things they may need to do after the EU withdrawal bill as we bring across retained EU law. So there's been very, very detailed discussion going on at official level about what's required. So it goes without saying that it's not ideal, but I would like to take this opportunity to commend John Spears and his team for the way that they've approached a difficult situation for them and standing up for Northern Ireland's interests.
Absolutely. Our civil servants have done a superb job in the absence of ministers. But no matter how talented and how able, and I have no doubt that he is, does he have ministerial decision-making powers?
No. Well, no. In the end, obviously, he doesn't.
No, exactly. So, what has been the impact of? Let me just repeat the question. What has been the impact of not having an Assembly and an executive and a minister representing Northern Ireland fisheries in the Brexit negotiations? A negative impact, or do civil servants just make ministers redundant?
I think it's not ideal, as I said, so we would have liked to, but it's also possible to exaggerate it. Obviously, fundamentally, fundamentally, the UK government is leading this negotiation, and we're working very closely with all of the devolved administrations, including Northern Ireland, where they don't have a political administration at the moment. But we're also very aware that the negotiation that's going on is being led by British officials, working with the Prime Minister and the European Commission on the other side. So a lot of that key work is being led by the UK anyway. And then when it comes to the future of our fisheries bill, we have had discussions with the Northern Ireland fishing industry. So Alan McCullough has been involved in what we plan to do, and we've had those discussions as well with the Northern Ireland Civil Service. And I think there's a consensus about the fundamentals here, and we can still manage and get by even without administration, in my view, at the moment.
Right. Well, that's very helpful. So, how often would you speak to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Karen Bradley, on this issue? And since it's the UK who's leading on the negotiations and we don't have a devolved assembly, so how often have you spoken to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who of course sits in the inner Brexit committee, cabinet committee? Yes.
Obviously, Michael Gove, our Secretary of State, talks to Karen Bradley very regularly on all of these issues, and in particular because she's also involved in the discussions on some of the elements pertinent to the EU negotiations. I also have meetings with a number of other ministers where we discuss this. So
as the fisheries minister with responsibility.
Yes, well, Lord Duncan has responsibility both for Scotland and for Northern Ireland in the Lords, and he is the minister who leads on some of these devolved issues there.
So when did you last speak to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland about this issue?
I personally haven't, but I can tell you that Michael Gove has. So they're obviously in the cabinet together. They meet regularly, at least weekly, and these issues have been discussed.
But you're a very experienced fisheries minister, I have to say, in the absence and continued absence of the Northern Ireland Assembly. And when fishing is so important to the community of Northern Ireland, I'm astonished, to put it mildly, that you haven't spoken to the Secretary of State. Perhaps you could follow up a meeting after this committee.
Well, I just repeat that Secretary of States tend to talk to Secretaries of State, and I have talked to Karen Bradley, but I can't recall specifically on fisheries, but I don't feel that I need to, because Michael Gove is very appraised of the situation, has a detailed knowledge of fishing, has picked up the brief incredibly quickly in his time as Secretary of State, and champions the interest of fishing regularly around the Cabinet table.
Was that a no to the suggestion that you might just raise this yourself with the Secretary of State?
Well, I can, but I just recently, just last week, in fact, I had a meeting with Lord Duncan, who is the Minister for Northern Ireland, and in Scotland as well, who is leading on fisheries issues for both those territorial offices. And he has a good grasp of the detail. And so, yes, we're in regular discussion.
And he visits Northern Ireland and the fishing community regularly?
I'm not sure I can ask him when he last visited, but yes, I'm sure he has.
That would be tremendously helpful if you asked him when he last visited Portobello or Kilkeel, indeed. Coming back to the EU withdrawal bill, which you touched on very briefly, right, the negotiations are, of course, by bringing all EU law back and making it part of our domestic law. Agriculture and fisheries are, of course, devolved responsibilities. So, how much, when we bring it all back from Europe, when we Brexit, how much is going to be devolved? Is it all responsibility for fishing and agriculture, but particularly because we're doing the debate on fisheries? Presumably, all of that responsibility, what was devolved to the Northern Ireland Assembly, will indeed be devolved. So the Northern Ireland Assembly will manage the fisheries around the coast of Northern Ireland.
Yes, and this will be an issue that we obviously address through the fisheries bill. But put simply, when it comes to fishing, most things such as technical regulations on nets and closures in waters and so on and so forth, minimum landing sizes, these would tend to be things that are done at a devolved level. You've obviously then got, in any fisheries, there's a big element of international diplomacy in all fisheries management. So annually the UK government will lead in a negotiation with our neighbours, and the total allowable catch, the envelope of quota that's created after that, obviously would be negotiated by and allocated by the UK government. So there would need to be some UK framework, and including on things such as access to our own waters within the UK.
So what powers would... That's fine, that the UK government is going to do the high diplomacy of it. I really want to know what powers the Northern Ireland Assembly is going to have over its fisheries. We're doing a fisheries inquiry. Fishermen in Northern Ireland want to know what responsibility will, we hope, the re-established Assembly and Minister have in Northern Ireland post-Brexit. Because they've been told, that everything is going to be rosy when we leave the EU. How rosy is it going to be?
Very rosy. Much better than being in the EU. I mean, so the key thing is they will get back, as I said...
Power over the size of the nets, I think, is what you've said. And then you moved on to the negotiation.
That's right. But the quota is always a matter for international negotiations. Yes. So if, to put it bluntly, if the Northern Ireland Assembly would not be able to take a unilateral decision to breach an international agreement that the UK had made on its behalf and to exceed quotas, and they wouldn't wish to anyway. But so the actual sort of what they call the tax and quota regulations, the setting of quota and fishing opportunities would be still need to be effectively part of a UK framework, because it would be subject to an international negotiation.
Yes.
However, when it comes to other technical measures around the management of fisheries, if they chose to say that they wanted to have a closure in their waters or have
how exactly will be their waters? What will be within Northern Ireland waters? What control?
Well,
I mean, it's the jurisdiction that they have now. They have their own zone within UK British fishery limits. So that zone will not change as a result of Brexit. So the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic will remain on both sides, on east and west, and the extent of their limits, sort of Northern Ireland managed limits, will continue as they are now, which is generally out to 12 miles, I think, or the median line where it meets Scotland or where it meets English jurisdiction, or Isle of Man, I think, as well. I think they're they're there as well. So
there'll be no change.
So no change in terms of their geographic scope, as there won't be for England, Wales, or Scotland. It'll be in relation to, as the Minister said, they will continue to manage fisheries. The details of the fisheries for local interests and for local needs, as they would currently be expecting to do now.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Minister, the leaked white paper doesn't suggest that fisheries policy in this country will be substantially different to that which is ordained by the common fisheries policy. Now, I don't expect you to comment on a leaked white paper, but I would ask you to say what substantial difference, areas of substantial deviation will there be from the CFP after we leave the European Union, because it isn't entirely clear from the material that has entered the public domain.
Well, obviously, as you said, we don't comment on leaked documents, but I think I've set out today the key areas where we see there being change. The first is that we intend to depart from relative stability shares as the relative stability key as an allocation method. This was set many years ago when quotas were first invented back in the late 70s and early 80s. And for various reasons, the UK does not get a fair share of stocks that are in its waters. So in parts of the country, such as the West Country, sometimes the French have 5 times as much haddock or cod as English fishermen get. So we want to depart from that and move to a new methodology, probably based predominantly around zonal attachment, as I said, and that's a big change. The other big change is that we will take our own seat in annual fisheries negotiations with Norway, with Faroes, and with the other coastal states. We don't do that at the moment. The other thing that we've said previously that we're considering is looking at the way we manage effort, particularly on the small fleet. So we're open to piloting things such as a days at sea approach for the small inshore vessels, the under 10s, as an alternative to a quota system, which is often a bit disproportionate for very small artisanal vessels. The final thing is we will have the ability to potentially restrict access to our waters in some cases. And this is a common feature of annual fisheries negotiations with other countries in the rest of the world, where you say, we will give you access to catch, say, 30% of your fish in our waters, but in return, we would like some inward exchanges of quota. That's a common feature of fisheries negotiations, and that's the type of agreement we'll strike. So it'll be very different in many ways. The current December Council system that we have would probably need to be transformed, because effectively fishing opportunities right around our waters and in the Channel and the North Sea and the Irish Sea would be set by an annual UK-EU bilateral deal rather than the current December Council.
Yes. In terms of when we take our seat on the North East Atlantic Fisheries Commission, quite important, isn't it? Because one of the levers we may have on the EU in order to ensure good behaviour would be our independent voice on that commission. When will we actually take that up? Will it be during the interim period, or will it be sometime thereafter? And linked to that, what remedies will we have during the implementation period for dealing with a situation where the EU doesn't actually act in good faith? For example, if it was unhelpful in terms of net sizes, which is something which does actually differentiate UK policy towards fisheries with those of many of our European neighbours. In those circumstances, what would we do? Because you will understand fishermen are concerned and understandably sceptical about the implementation period of what it might mean for them.
Yes, I understand that they are. On your first point, we will join those regional fisheries management organisations, including NAFO, which is the North Atlantic Fisheries Organisation that covers seas to the south of Greenland and Iceland. And we will also join NEAF, the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission, which deals predominantly with mackerel negotiations and coastal states negotiations. And we will join those and any other bodies we need to during the implementation period, because we will be sitting as an independent country in December 2020 to discuss opportunities for 2021. So it is one area where we will need to rejoin those. It's a fairly straightforward process.
During the implementation? During
the implementation period. And we would probably need, I think the process of joining the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission is a matter of months, so it's between 3 and 6 months, I think. And we would therefore need to be joining that during the course of 2020. And sorry, on your second point, obviously the agreement on the transition agreement does have a good faith clause in it. This is a common feature of, so I know some people can say, well, does that mean anything? But such clauses are a common feature of international agreements, and there is a good faith clause there that we would be able to fall back on should the EU take an action that is that clearly done in bad faith and calculated to attack our interests.
Okay, thank you. Gregory Campbell.
I just want to take you back to the issue that you raised at the beginning of the session, the agreement that we had with the Republic, where they have been in breach for, I think you said for 2 years now?
Well, 18 months.
18 months, yes. Yeah. If you were an average Northern Ireland fisherman in the context of the last 18 months, sitting beside the average Republic of Ireland fisherman in the past 18 months, who would feel more pleased or embittered?
Well, my experience with fishermen, I've dealt with fishermen for 5 years, they're not always very happy. But I would say, look, it's not a sustainable position that we have an asymmetric agreement, obviously, on voisinage, and for all the reasons I described.
It's not sustainable for whom?
Not for us. We are committed to the principles of the voisinage agreement. We've been clear about that because it dates right back to the formation of the Irish Republic, and it's a long-standing agreement that predates the EU. The Irish Republic tell us that they're committed to it too, and they tell us that they're committed to bringing forward the prime legislation to correct the constitutional defect.
But who is disadvantaged in the current interregnum, in the 18 months?
Well, clearly, Northern Ireland fishermen are disadvantaged because they can't access Republic waters.
Right. So for 18 months, the Northern Ireland fishermen have been disadvantaged. Does that automatically mean then the Republic of Ireland fishermen have been advantaged?
No, it means that the Republic of Ireland fishermen have had continued to enjoy the access as provided for under voisinage, because we've continued to abide by the terms of the voisinage agreement.
That sounds to me like they're advantaged compared to Northern Ireland fishermen.
Well, they've not been disadvantaged in the way that Northern Ireland fishermen have. So they continue to enjoy the access that they've always had. Northern Ireland fishermen are not currently able to access waters in the Irish Republic in a way that they would have done previously.
Okay, so Northern Ireland fishermen are at a disadvantage, and the Republic of Ireland fishermen, however you wish to describe it, are in a better place compared to their Northern Ireland counterpart, because of our position vis-à-vis not taking any action?
Well, because we've taken a position to date that we will take, in good faith, the commitment of the Irish Republic to abide by this agreement and to bring forward the primary legislation to correct the problem that they have. And so, for the reasons I described earlier, and the fact that we have a lot of other fisheries issues that are on the table being talked about at the moment, we've not chosen at this stage to suspend the agreement from our side. But also, as I said, it's not a sustainable position, so if we get to a position where we sense that the Irish government are not serious about their commitment to voisinage, well then obviously we would have to suspend the agreement.
Well, can you see why the fishing industry UK-wide were so much in favour of Brexit? I mean, you alluded to your blog of some time ago, where it would appear fishermen throughout the UK would have thought they were effectively stitched up, like a kipper maybe, not to use a pun. But they didn't get a good deal there from the EU. And it looks now as if the Northern Ireland fishermen isn't getting a good deal in the Republic of Ireland because of our deference to abiding by mutually entered into agreements, is doing better than his Northern Ireland counterpart. And I think you used the word we would have to consider what we would do. Is it not past time that we considered doing something and actually done something?
I think there's another point I would make here. We have to recognise that it wasn't a political decision of the Irish government to cease abiding by the Voisinage Agreement. It was a court judgment by the Irish Supreme Court that put them in this position.
Which they have been in for 18 months.
That's right. And they committed very soon after that. I met Michael Creed after that. They said that they, obviously it was a judgment of the court that they had to recognise, but they intended to bring forward the primary legislation to correct it. So the Irish Republic is still very clear that they are committed to the Voisinage Agreement. I think, to be fair, in our dealings with them, we have to recognise that they've had a particular problem with their Supreme Court. It's had a judgment that's created a particular problem for them. Had they taken a political decision to suspend the agreement, I think it would be different. But they have been put in this position by a judgment of their Supreme Court. And so I think it's slightly different for those reasons. But nevertheless, as I said earlier, they've given them our word. They've given us their word that they intend to bring forward primary legislation. We need to see that happen.
When was the last time you spoke to them about their bringing forward the primary legislation?
Well, at official level, I'm not sure, but I met Michael Creed, last year, late last year, where we discussed this. And as I said, we are in the process at the moment about to write a letter, and I had a meeting with officials just last week to review where we are with this and to say we needed to apply some
But when you say late last year, does that mean October, November? Or
I can't remember, but it was at one of the Fisheries Council meetings. I met Michael Creed. I'm afraid I can't recall which one it was, but it was
Can
last
we
week.
be informed then? I'm sure you'll be able to track down.
We
when
probably
that was.
can, yes.
Just to get an idea, I mean, if it's more than 6 months ago, I would be very disappointed and surprised that in the absence of the government of the Republic indicating to you when they intend to bring forward primary legislation, that we haven't actually gone back to them and said, well, we haven't heard anything. Are you going to do it next month, the month after? Is it 2018 or is it 2019? How much longer must Northern Ireland fishermen be disadvantaged? And the Irish Republic, it would appear, aren't very exercised about doing what they need to do. I accept totally it wasn't a political decision, but it was a decision by their High Court which put them in a position where they indicated to our government, we will now take the necessary action to remedy this. And they haven't done it. When are they going to do it? That's what we need to say. Hopefully it'll be more than a letter going to them to say it. We need to be meeting them immediately and saying, when are you going to do this? Are you intending to do that in the next week or in the next month?
Well, this was on the agenda, and Michael Gove had a planned meeting with Michael Creed in the Irish Republic. I think that's been delayed. That was imminent. That was going to take place, I think, this week originally, but for other parliamentary reasons that's not now taken place. But it is. They will be rescheduling that meeting, and it will be high on the agenda for the Secretary of State's meeting.
When you say reschedule, when is that likely to take place?
I don't know. I have many responsibilities, but the Secretary of State's diary isn't one of them. But it will be. They want to reschedule that meeting, and it may be that in the absence of that, it's something that I would pick up at the next council meeting.
Perhaps John, I could write to the Secretary of State to establish that. It just seems to me intolerable that this is a continuing problem that doesn't seem to have exercised minds. And the Republic don't seem to have been exercised, unless they can explain why the delay is. Well then, if there's an explanation, let's hear it.
I think we can certainly write and ask what urgency has been given to this matter. Although, in fairness to Dublin, I think if I was answering this particular case, I would have to point out that the delay in their sea fisheries bill finalisation probably can be set against the delay in the UK in relation to the aforementioned fisheries bill, which I started my questioning with.
Well, let's hear it. Okay,
John
thanks,
Brennan.
Yes, Minister, I mean, just a couple of questions. And when you were listing the sorts of things that could change after Brexit as regards fishing, you didn't mention management of quotas and so on and things. I wouldn't expect you to comment on the leaked document, but obviously the various fishing representatives, as I'm sure they're approaching you as they're approaching us, saying there's particular areas they'd like to see change. Is that, would there be potential change in how quotas were managed, and potentially could there be new quotas, possibly by tender or whatever mechanism was chosen?
Yes, I mean there's a number of things that I've floated publicly and are likely to be in the white paper when it's published. And as I said earlier, one of the areas we're considering is whether, particularly on the small-scale artisanal inshore fleet, the under-10s, whether a straightforward quota regime is a proportionate way to manage effort, and whether we should pilot using something more like an effort regime, a days at sea regime, or possibly a hybrid model of the two. So we're looking at different systems there. And we've also suggested that as we depart from relative stability and have new quota come in, we probably should consider allocating that on a different methodology than the so-called FQA units. So at the moment we have fixed quota allocations that are attached to vessels.
Yep.
And the total allowable catch, the national envelope that we have on that, is literally divvied up along an FQA units approach, which is literally just based on historic track record of an individual vessel. And it's not a particularly satisfactory way to run a quota regime, but it's the one that's been established for a long time. And I think that over time we would probably want to start to consider better ways of allocating quota.
Which could encourage new entrants, for example.
Exactly. So you could have a tender system and judge producer organisations on their commitment to the environment, their commitment to coastal communities, the work they're doing to get new entrants, as you said, into the sector. We may also use some of it to help manage the discard ban. So we've said that we're considering a system akin to a kind of super levy, so that you don't ban fishermen from going to sea if they don't have quota, but if they land over quota fish, the financial penalty to them means the fish isn't worth anything to them. So you actually enable them to carry on fishing, but find an alternative way to discourage fishing vulnerable species. So there's a number of interesting things that we are giving consideration to in this space.
Very interesting. But then I wish the government well in their negotiations and so on, but one possibility is obviously no deal, and although the government would do everything possible to avoid that, but presumably there are contingency plans. If there's no deal, do we have to have a fisheries bill rather quicker to deal with the situation? Well, it'd be next March, wouldn't it?
Yes, if there's no deal, as in, I mean, there's two things. One, the scenario we're aiming for, obviously, is that we get a withdrawal agreement and heads of terms on a future economic partnership by the autumn that Parliament can then endorse, and everyone's happy. One variation that might be that people would agree the withdrawal agreement, but that a future economic partnership remains elusive, and that therefore there is the transition period, but then effectively something akin to a no-deal Brexit at the end of that. And then the third option would be that there's no deal at all, so there's not even an agreement on the withdrawal agreement. And under those situations, yes, we would need to have all the powers in place in the fisheries bill by the end of March next year.
And there's contingency plans being worked up for that eventuality.
Yes, so we've had the MMO working on issues such as enforcement, working out what day one capacity would need to be in such a scenario. They've done a lot of work around what additional capacity they might need to process more catch certificates for our exports. They have also done work about other IT systems, other resourcing that we need to consider.
The government is actively
preparing for a no deal scenario. Is that what you're telling this committee?
It's not a secret. The government has always said right from the beginning that it is doing contingency planning for a no-deal situation, because frankly you have to do that as a precaution. But it's definitely not our clearly it's not our preferred approach. We want there to be a deal and an agreement, but we have always from the beginning been very clear that there's also contingency planning going on for a no-deal scenario.
And what would be the consequences for Northern Ireland if there were no deal?
Well, that's a very large discussion, because obviously there would be all sorts of issues that we'd have to work out around borders and tariffs and everything else. So that's why we are aiming for an agreement.
But you must recognise that in fact a no deal situation for Northern Ireland is not acceptable. It's unthinkable. Would you agree it is unthinkable that we would have no deal at the end of this?
No, because we've taken a decision to leave the EU, and at the end, I would simply put to the committee that if you want to get an agreement on anything, you do have to be willing to walk away. Otherwise, you're not a credible person around the table.
Irrespective of the consequences for Northern Ireland?
The way you get a deal is by having the strength to be prepared for there not being a deal. And if you approach a negotiation in the way that you're so craven because you don't have any options, you won't get a good deal. And if we want a good deal, we therefore have to be prepared for no deal. And paradoxically, the most likely way to get a deal is to make sure that we're ready for no deal, so that we have the strength to land the right deal.
Minister, I think you put that very eloquently, and it pretty much brings us to the end of our time. Can I thank you very much indeed for your answers today? They most certainly will form a very important part of our report into this issue when it's published. Thank you very much indeed to you, and also to Mr. Gooding.
Thank you.